So great. So let's start. So good morning, everybody. Good morning. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Markus Rantala, who is from the University in Turku, from Finland. And he's an evolutionary biologist, evolutionary psychologist. He has PhD in biology and psychology, right? I think you need to correct me afterwards if I say something wrong. And he studies lots of different species and lots of different subjects, including sexual selection and sexual attractiveness, partner choice, also the immunology and also psychopathology, which are all of them actually my favorite topics. I hope that yours will be as well. So actually now it's your word, and I'm really happy to welcome you over here, and thank you for coming for us.
Thank you for inviting me. So today's topics could actually be also evolutionary psychology of beauty, but because beauty is not so easy to define, I rather not use the word beauty. So I became interested why there is individual variation in attractiveness. When you look people's face, you can immediately say whether you find them attractive or not. And it's very interesting if you put person to brain scanner, it's possible to see whether you like the face or not from those brain scanning images before people is aware what that picture is about. So that hypothalamus activates, and those areas which are associated with attractive face, they are activated more early than the frontal lobes, which is associated with your ability to identify what that picture is about. So, because it's so fast reaction, it's very interesting whether it's innate or whether there is learned components. And in social science, it's often talked that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But is that really so? There's a lot of studies in psychology where they have used babies and small kids with eye tracker, and they have presented pictures from beautiful faces and ugly faces, and look how children like to watch them. And for example, they have make composite faces from beautiful faces and less beautiful faces, and they have presented those for kids. And it seems that kids around the world prefer to watch those faces what also adults find attractive. And if you add features of bad health or maybe asymmetry, they are less interested to watch those faces, and they may even start to cry when you present them a very ugly face. And that's interesting because if our standard of beauty are learned, how on earth babies who are a couple of weeks old have learned that? So it must be innate. And there is also studies with a little bit older kids where they have provided dolls with which are manipulated so that some of them are less attractive than others. And it seems interesting that infants prefer to play with longer with those dolls which also adults find attractive. And so if you add a feature of the bad health or old age or make them fat, then children are not interested to play so long time with those. So that's also suggests that we have quite strong important standard of beauty. And there is also very beautiful study done in blind men. They make female plastic models where they change their body shape, and they ask those blind men to choose which one they found most attractive. And it was very interesting that they did prefer exactly same plastic models than those men who were able to see. All men prefer hourglass-shaped women bodies. And it's interesting because it has been shown that those women who have hourglass-shaped body, they have higher estrogen levels and their fertility is higher. And I doubt that nobody has teach blind men how attractive woman body should feel, so it must be innate preference. There is also other kind of evidence. 30 years ago, researchers started to study whether there is universal standard of facial beauty, and they start to present pictures from faces to people around the world and ask them to rate their attractiveness. For example, the first one was this Cunningham study where they present women facial pictures to males in a different ethnic group around the world, and it was very surprising that they found out that the ratings of facial attractiveness was very, very similar, almost identical around the world. So in all cultures, men prefer same woman faces, and it also was interesting that exposure to Western media had no influence on the facial ratings. And in all those cultures, men prefer women with large eyes, small noses, high cheekbones, small chin, and large smile. And after that, people have done a lot of studies, and they have shown that in all cultures, men prefer very similar facial features in women. There is not a single culture where men prefer old women as their mate, or there is no single culture where men prefer women which have signs of bad health. So it seems that in all culture, men prefer those women who has highest fertility. And so it seems that the standard of beauty are not arbitrary cultural conventions like long-held view in social science states. And here is, for example, composite face from TV stars in different parts of the world. And it seems that those which people have rated the most attractive, they are actually quite similar in their facial attractiveness and the facial features. So it's very clear that we have wide standard, we have a universal standard of beauty which is very, very, very similar around the world. Of course, there is differences, but it seems that there is much more similarities around the world. But if we want to understand this standard of beauty, it's very difficult to understand it if we study only human species. But if we look other animals, we can see the big picture and we can make hypotheses what we can test and look whether the same phenomenon or patterns exist in humans than in other animals. In many species, males have beautiful secondary sexual ornaments like large antlers or beautiful colors or long tails. And in many species, it has been shown that females prefer those males which have those beautiful ornaments. But the interesting thing is why do women or females prefer those males who are attractive? So what females benefit about preferring those males? Because if we look animal kingdom, we can see that those most beautiful and bright ornaments are usually in those species where males do not provide any parental care. So it seems that only benefits what females would get from those males would be genetic benefits, so that by mating with those attractive males, females might increase viability of their offsprings. And it has been suggested that one of those benefits would be that by preferring males which have bright colors or large secondary sexual ornaments, females would enhance or improve the immune system of their offsprings. And I did study that topic more than 10 years in insects and other invertebrates. I was able to show, for example, in damsel flies that the size of secondary sexual ornaments, which is the wing spots, is associated with their immune system, so that when females mate with males who have large wing spots, they might get genes which make them their offsprings more healthy because they would have stronger immune defense. In drumming wool spider, we were able to show that drumming which attract females is honest signal of male health. And in Tenebrium monitor, is also called as mealworm, pheromones reveal their health. And also with crickets, we were able to show that their song also is associated with their health. And in Drosophila melanogaster, we were able to show that immune defense plays important role on when we made genetic modified fruit flies, and we were able to show that if they lack immune system, it had influence on their mating success. And also in earwigs, we were able to show that size of these forceps was associated with male health and good immunity. So after studying a decade other animals, I became interested to study this same topic in humans. And actually, it's quite surprising that if you compare any other primates, humans are quite sexually dimorphic, and both sex has secondary sexual ornaments. And I became interested whether these secondary sexual ornaments are associated with mate quality and immune system. For example, we know that it's very easy to identify the sex of the person just looking at their faces. And it would be very interesting to know if there differences in facial attractiveness would be associated with their health or strength of immune defense in general. We know that parasites and pathogens play important role of evolution. So we have had a lot of parasites and pathogens during our evolutionary history. And just by definition, they cause harm for the host. And because of that harm, we have got psychological adaptation to avoid those. And one adaptation is aversion. So aversion is psychological adaptation to avoid contagion. So if you look clear sign of bad health, it usually reduce or even make very strong aversion, so that you are not interested to have sex with a man who looks like that or a woman who like that. And it's very clear why, because none of those who find this kind of man attractive are not your ancestor, because these are the signs of syphilis, and this woman has a lepra, so of course those men who find this kind of woman attractive, they are not your ancestors because they probably died. And in many animals it has been shown that if you infect males, that infection reduces the size of secondary sexual ornaments, and that's why it's not so interesting to study whether clear signs of bad health or pathogen infection reduce the attractiveness in humans. it's more interesting to do to see whether variation between healthy people in their facial attractiveness is associated with strength of immune defense, like we could predict based on studies in other animals. And in my doctoral thesis in psychology, I did study biological basis of beauty, and we did an experimental studies to test whether those features which we found attractive, whether they are associated with health and strength of immune system. So I did a study where I took photos from 74 Latvian men, and after that I asked women to rate attractiveness of each face, and we had about 100 women who rated those faces, and for each man we were able to calculate how attractive on average females found them. And after that I measured the strength of their immune system, and I did it by injecting them with Hepatitis B vaccine. That Hepatitis B is a very common viral disease that infects liver, and about 2 billion people have been infected with that hepatitis virus during their lifetime, and so it's recommended to take this vaccine if you travel outside Scandinavia, because in Scandinavia it's very rare, but in other parts of the world it's very common. And so we first took a blood sample from men to check whether they have antibodies against that. So, but we didn't find any of those participants any antibodies. And after that we vaccinated them, and 1 month later we took blood sample and measured amount of antibodies produced. And it has been shown that ability to produce antibodies against that vaccine is very strongly associated with their ability to resist that virus in real life. So then we did look how the facial attractiveness ratings of women are associated with men's ability to produce those antibodies. And there was positive correlation, so those men who women find most attractive, they have more antibodies than those who were less attractive. And there was a group of men who didn't produce any antibodies, and those were the least attractive ones. This is a box-Cox transformed, so that's why it doesn't look logical, but yeah, but the pattern is same. We replicated this with larger sample size, and we got the same results. So it seems to quite robust association, so that facial attractiveness is associated with strength of immune defense in men. And it would be interesting to show you the pictures of those men who have poor immune system and those who have a strong immune system, but none of those men wanted to have their pictures presented for anyone, but all of those men wanted that you can show their face. But I want to show how does faces of those men who have poor immune system, how they look like, and that's why I made composite face, so that I calculate mathematical model of the faces for each man, and then when I have two faces with mathematical model, then we can make average face from them. So this is average face from those two faces. It looks like a real person, but it's average. And using these methods, I make composite face from 8 men who has the lowest antibody response, and 8 men who had highest production of antibodies. And this is the results. So in the right-hand side, it's the composite face from those men who has strongest immune defense, and this is the composite face from those who have weakest immune defense. and you can see clear difference in face. So this looks like a professional football player, and this looks like a person who likes to watch football. So there's clear difference. And it's important to note that these faces are much more attractive than any of those original faces, even the composite face from the least attractive ones. And that's because they are completely symmetrical, and the skin quality is excellent, and also all individual unattractive facial features has disappeared from this, so that that's why they look much more attractive. But anyway, you can see that there's clear differences in facial structure between those, and I became interested what causes this difference. And it's known that testosterone prevents accumulation of fat tissue in the faces. So after seeing this picture, I became interested whether testosterone might explain these differences. So we measured testosterone level from the males. We took 3 samples from each males every month, and then we averaged that, and then we did look how it was associated with facial attractiveness. And it was very interesting that there is very strong association between testosterone level and facial attractiveness, so that those men who were most attractive, they had highest testosterone level. And it's interesting if testosterone make you more attractive. Why not all men just have high testosterone level? What is the mechanism which keep that facial attractiveness as honest signal of male health? So I did look what is association between testosterone level and strength of immune defense, and I became surprised that there was very strong association with, so that those men who had highest immunocompetence, they had also highest level of testosterone. And so this also sounds weird, because why not all men just maintain as high testosterone level as possible? And then I did look whether there would be some kind of mediator which would explain this pattern. And I looked whether stress hormone cortisol level are associated with strength of immune defense, but there was no clear association between immune responsiveness and cortisol level. And after looking at the pattern, we noticed that there was actually very interesting interaction between testosterone level and cortisol immune response. So when we did group males according to whether they have high testosterone level or low testosterone level, or high cortisol or low cortisol, we found out that those men who had high testosterone level and high cortisol level, they had strongest immune response, and those men who had low testosterone level but high cortisol, they had weakest immune response. And when I did look how this is associated with facial attractiveness, I did understand the mechanism which make facial attractiveness as honest signal of male health. So we found out that those men who had high testosterone level but low stress hormone level were the most attractive ones, and those men who had high testosterone but high cortisol level, they were least attractive one. And that makes sense, because it seems that men maintain their testosterone level in the level which is optimal for their health, and if they increase it too much, it increases their stress hormone, and the stress hormone is the mechanism which makes you less attractive. It's known that stress causes acne, it causes accumulation of fat, and many kinds of other health problems. And it's interesting that in puberty many men will get acne, and that's because during puberty their testosterone level goes up, and if their health is poor, then it increases stress hormone level, and the stress hormone causes acne. And also vice versa, if men start to use anabolic steroids, that anabolic steroids also increase their stress hormone level, and that's why they often get acne, and usually that using anabolic steroids does not make them more attractive, because the facial feature do not change more attractive, because it also changed cortisol level. So I calculate how testosterone changed facial structures, and here is my original faces, and then I increase amount of testosterone associated features to my faces, and this is how I would look like if I would have 50% higher testosterone level, and this is how I would look like if I would have 50% lower testosterone level. So it's clear that testosterone has effect on facial attractiveness, and it's interesting that when we present this woman, some women like this kind of faces, and some women like this kind of faces, and there's huge variation in preferences. And of course, there is other features that influence on attractiveness, and what one is known to influence is fluctuating asymmetry in face, and it's been shown in many animals that females prefer males who are symmetric, and it has been suggested that symmetry would be some kind of indicator of developmental stability during the development, and it would be also signal of quality. And we did a study where we measured the symmetry of the faces from the males, and we vaccinated them and measured amount of antibodies. But we were also interested to look how childhood influence how attractive you are. And so we collected data about what were the family incomes during that time when person was young, and during that cohort which we had in our study was born during the time of collapse of Soviet Union, and during that time there was a shortage of food and a very poor economic situation in Latvia, and there was huge difference between families, and we found that that family incomes had quite strong associate between testosterone levels, and it also had very strong associate between strength of immune defense. So it seems that your family background influence how attractive you are, and of course the mechanism is clear, because if you have good diet and good health service and other things, it influences how attractive you are. And the mechanism is interesting, that testosterone influence on facial attractiveness, and of course amount of fat tissue in the faces, and amount of fat tissue in the face actually reduced facial attractiveness too. And interesting, the immune system, strength of immune system was also associated with the amount of symmetry in faces. So men who were more symmetric, they had stronger immune defense. And it's interesting that facial masculinity itself was not associated with facial attractiveness. It was mediated only through the testosterone. And of course, it's clear that fluctuating asymmetry influence on mate choice. Here is my original face, and there is my face that has made completely symmetrical. And if you look, you can see that it's much more attractive. It looks like I have higher intelligence and more healthy, and so that's why I'm not surprised about that result. So it seems that fluctuating asymmetry is associated with development during the childhood. And I became also interested to study what are those traits in the body that signals good immune competence, because of course mate choice is not only about the faces, it's also attractiveness to body influence on mate choice. And we made a study where we took a picture from the men bodies from 3 different angles, and we presented those to women, and we asked them to choose which one they find most attractive. And And then we need a statistical model, and it came that there was 2 factors which explained body attractiveness. And it was also interesting that adiposity was the highest predictor of body attractiveness. Of course, for women it's quite obvious that women do not like men who have beer belly. They rather prefer men who has six-pack. So that explains the link. And masculinity has also effect, but it was weaker. And there might be good reason for that, because adiposity reflects current health status better than masculinity. Masculinity is a result of much longer time. So it's testosterone level during the puberty influence a lot on masculinity, but this is something which changed very fast. And it was also interesting that strength of immunity system was associated with adiposity, and that's because it's mediated by testosterone. So it's known that testosterone influence on masculinity a lot. This is a man who just got testosterone, and like you see, his body changed a lot just because of testosterone. And also the faces, like I told you, if they start to use anabolic steroids, they don't become more attractive because amount of fat tissue will be increased because of cortisol level. So it's honest signal. You are not able to cheat it by using anabolic steroids. And so there is a tip for men. So if men would like to look more attractive, or women, they should not worry so much about building massive muscles. Actually, studies shows that when you present pictures from males to women, most of women found bodybuilders aversive. So many men do not believe that, but actually it's true that that women rather choose average men than bodybuilder. And that's when we ask why, most of women say that those look like narcissistic person and other personal traits which are not what women prefer as a long-term mates. So if men want to look more attractive, better strategy would be follow healthy lifestyle and of course exercise, but you don't need to use anabolic steroids or big muscles. And it was interesting that after we published it, that our study in Africa, researchers make another study where they measured a little bit different parameters of immune system, but they also got the same results, so that when they measured men's ability to produce cytokines, which also associated with strength of immunity, they found that those men who were better to produce cytokines, they were more masculine and more attractive for women. So this seems to be a universal pattern. But because I'm also biologist, I am interested about proximate mechanism behind this attractiveness. And it has been suggested that MAC heterozygosity is especially important for immune function, because MAC alleles encode peptides that bind and present a restricted range of antigen peptides to T cells, thereby initiating a rapid immune response. And it has been shown in India that MAC heterozygosity is positively correlated with resistance against viral infection, including hepatitis B. So that's why we did make genetic analysis from those participants in our previous studies, and we look whether heterozygosity in MAC were associated with attractiveness and strength of immune defense. And what we found was actually something that I didn't expect. Of course, we found that heterozygosity was associated with body attractiveness and facial attractiveness. So maybe this suggests that you should prefer persons as mates who are genetically very different than you do, because it will produce children which are in better health and more attractive. But also there was associated with the fat percent, so that those who were heterozygous, they were more lean. And what we found very surprising was that there was correlation between age and heterozygosity. And that was surprising because, of course, heterozygosity does not change with the age. But because we did use students here, it seems that those who graduated faster, they were more heterozygostic. So, so that's maybe explain the results. Anyway, it was also interesting that some of those MHC genes and alleles are more strongly associated with facial attractiveness. And actually, there was one gene which was statistically significantly more strongly associated with facial attractiveness. And of course, there is other features that influence on mate choice, and one is body height. And it has been shown around the world that women prefer men who are a little bit taller than they are, and usually they prefer men who are a little bit taller than average in the population. And we wanted to know why, and because we had collected big sample size, we just looked at whether when height was associated with strength of immune defense. Yeah, and yeah, it was, but it was not like we expected. We found out that those men who were a little bit taller than the average, they had strongest immune defense, but those men who were very tall, they had weaker, and also those who were shorter than average. So this suggests that there might be some kind of trade-off between growth and immune defense in the childhood. Maybe the childhood environment, if you have poor economic condition, then you are not able to invest both on the immune system and growth. And also it's known that many health problems during the childhood influence on your growth. So maybe that's explaining why there is positive correlation in this part of distribution. So it's also known that height influence on facial structure, so that those men who are taller, they have higher amount of growth hormone, and it's influence the structure of the faces. So that's why this might look man who's more masculine, but that's not true. That's the effect of growth hormone. It's not effect of testosterone. So if you look at Hollywood film stars, they are often very short because those men who are shorter, then they have more attractive faces. So there is trade-off. So you can be taller and woman-like, but then your faces are less attractive. It's quite interesting trade-off. And actually the same seems to be also in women. So if you are short, you need to be worried because then you might be on average a little bit attractive in faces and vice versa. So human life is complicated because we have always sexual conflict in humans, so that what is beneficial for women might not be beneficial for men and vice versa. And it has been shown that those men who are masculine, they are less likely to invest in offsprings and relatives than more feminine men. And masculine men cheat more their girlfriend with other women, and they pay less gifts, and they spend much less time with their children and so on. And interesting question is why. There is evidence that those men who are less attractive, they try to compensate the fact that they are physically less attractive by investing more in offspring and relationships, and they are even on average more romantic. And there is evidence that this is mediated by testosterone. So testosterone makes men face more masculine and attractive, but women consider them to be more untrustworthy, and of course they also are more dominant. But testosterone also reduces tendency to fall in love, and it makes men less romantic. There is experimental evidence for that. When you inject testosterone for men, they found their spouses less attractive, and they became more attracted from other women, and they also report that they, after using anabolic steroids, they are less in love with their own spouse. So that makes it complicated, the life, because if women want to have attractive man, it means that also other women find that man attractive, and and it increased odds that he will see it and invest less. But if you want to have a man who is willing to invest a lot of children and take care of children, then you will end up with a man who is less attractive. And that makes choice of partner very difficult. But luckily, natural selection has helped us. So it seems that sex hormones influence our mate choice. That when women have high level of estrogen, she prefer more masculine men, and when the estrogen levels are lower, they prefer more men who invest on offsprings and provide parental care. And now there is more than 100 studies to show that when women are close to ovulation and they are able to become pregnant, they prefer more masculine facial features. and during the non-fertile period, they start to prefer those men who invest more on offsprings. So it has been suggested that this would be adaptation, that when they are able to become pregnant, they prefer good genes, and other times they prefer men who provide parental care. And it's also interesting that when women become pregnant, her mate choice changes so that they start to prefer those schools of which are associated with higher parental care. And it's not only about facial structure, also they start to prefer more masculine behavior men. I have to drink a little bit. So we did a study where we presented those men pictures to women and looked whether women preference for immunity defense changed with the cycle, and yeah, it did, so that women has stronger preference for men with a strong immunity defense when they were close to ovulation than during the other time of their cycle. So usually when I have presented this talk, after my talk, men ask how they can attract women based on evolutionary psychology. And so avoid that question, I will tell you that, of course, facial attraction or body attraction is not only things that matter in one mate choice. Women pay attention for many other traits. For example, it's known that if you want to be more attractive for women, you should show evidence of ambition, hard work, and intelligence, because those are the traits which women around the world find attractive in men. Women also prefer generous men, so buying gifts or give money to charity intrigues the attractiveness of man. Also, how you dress up influence, which signals social status and many other things. And also, you should behave the way which attracts women, like to be very confident and assertive, especially around other males. And women also prefer men who are a little bit taller than they are, so you should target women who are shorter than you are. And of course, you can influence your facial and physical attractiveness, because health influence on your testosterone level and strength of immune defense. And also the smell has influence on mate choice, that people prefer, of course, good hygiene plays a role, but they also prefer MHCs, dissimilar men, and also because women, especially when they are searching long-term mates, they prefer men who provide parental care. So you should behave a way which shows that you would be good father, so should be nice towards babies and children. And what if you can't manage any of these? Is there any hope anymore to find a woman? And the good thing is to be a man is actually there is one thing. So if you are very rich and famous, you can compensate all of those traits. For example, it has been shown that in USA that if you earn $10,000 more during the year, it's make you as much attractive as if you would be 10 centimeters taller. So you can compensate those physical features by being more rich. And I'm pretty sure that Anna Nicole Smith didn't marry him because of his sexual attractiveness, but he was billionaire and he died a couple of months after the weddings. And I'm pretty sure that Hugh Hefner wasn't so attracted that without being famous. So he was in his 90s or something, and he still had 3 girlfriends at the same time. So how about the men's choice? What do men want? Actually, usually people only study female choice in humans, but that's because usually men are not so interested about what men prefer, because men are quite simple, so there is much less variation in what men want. And of course, there is huge variation in attractiveness of women, and it's interesting what does that variation in attractiveness signals. So what are the biological factors behind that? And we did similar study in women than in men, but it was much harder to get participants for this study than in men's studies, because we wanted to use only participants who didn't took any hormonal contraceptions, because there is some evidence that it might influence on attractiveness. So we recruited 65 young Latvian women who were 20 to 21 years old, and we took pictures from them, and then we took plasma sample, and then we vaccinated them. And we took those pictures during the fertile phase of their cycle, because it's known that women attractiveness changes with their cycle. And what we found was not what we expected, because there was no any kind of association between strength of immune defense and attractiveness in women. I was so surprised that most attractive women didn't produce any antibodies at all. And when we looked at data, it was also surprising that variation in strength of immune defense was much larger among women than among men. And that may also explain something, because if a woman in every generation, they have preferred those men who have strongest immune defense, then you would expect that there is less variation in immune defense between men. And if men do not pay attention on women's strength of immune defense, you could expect that there is much more variation among them. But of course, there is possible that some other factors may explain that. But anyway, there was huge variation between women. But then we found that there was one factor which has very strong effect on facial attractiveness, and that was the cortisol level. So stress hormone cortisol was pretty strongly associated with facial attractiveness, and this was measured from the blood. So we took 3 blood samples and we averaged them, and so it does not reflect only stress hormone levels in one moment, but it's more like long-term stress hormone levels. So it seems that those women who have chronic stress, they are much less attractive than those who don't have stress. And that actually makes sense, because stress hormone has been shown to influence estrogen levels. So there is trade-off between reproduction and survival, so that for example, in animals, if they feel stress, they reduce their estrogen level and they postpone their reproduction to better times. And that seems to be the case also in humans. So gynecologists say that many times when there is partners who are not able to get children, those problems are associated with chronic stress, because chronic stress reduces estrogen level. And when they are able to alleviate that stress, then estrogen level comes up and ovulation happens and they are able to become pregnant. So it seems that men are adapted to pay attention on those features that reflect current reproductive health of women. So, and of course, it's quite clear that cortisol increase acne in women, and acne make women less attractive, and also because estrogen influence attractiveness a lot, and its influence on growth of the hair and quality of skin and many other factors. It's explained this association. In addition to cortisol, also adiposity was associated with facial attractiveness, so that those women who were obese, they were less attractive, and also those women who were anorexic or very thin, they were less attractive. So men prefer those women who has average body mass index, so those who were healthy ones. And so it seems that in contrast to men, facial attractiveness in women does not signal immune response, it signals something else. And it's quite interesting why there is so huge sex difference. And of course, we know that one factor that plays important role in the facial attractiveness in women is facial attractiveness. So, for example, if you increase testosterone, women look less attractive. and when you reduce amount of testosterone, they become more attractive. And if we ask men to rate women's faces according to the femininity and also with attractiveness, there is correlation of 0.8 between facial attractiveness and femininity, so they are very strongly associated. And there is studies to show that those women who have highest estrogen level, they look more feminine. So this is composite face. Actually, the citation is missing. It's in this study, and it was also interesting that they found that those women who have higher maternal tendencies, they had more feminine faces. So they asked women how many children they would like to have, and those women who were feminine in their face, they wanted to have more children. So that's why it's, of course it would be adaptive for men to prefer those features, because they would have higher thinness. We did a study where we manipulate facial masculinity in women, and we presented 20 pairs of faces which will either make more feminine or masculine, and for each man we calculate how strong preference for facial feminine they had, and we presented this in different countries around the world, and what we found was quite interesting pattern. We found that there was there's a lot of variation between men in their preference, but there was also a lot of variation between different countries. In some countries, men has stronger preference for femininity than in others. And if I remember correctly, we had more than 10,000 participants in this study, and this was the pattern. So we found that in Japan, men had very strong preference for facial femininity, and in Nepal and Nigeria they had weak preference. There is Brazil here, so Brazil at about same level than in Mexico and in Finland. And when we did look what are those ecological factors which might be explain this pattern, we found that in countries which has highest national health score, so that the people with better health, they had stronger preference for femininity. And it has been shown in men that those men who have higher testosterone level, they have stronger preference for facial femininity, and that may explain the pattern. And it was interesting that we published this article in biological letters, but science became interested about that, and they wrote a paper about that, and it was published in Science. So we could 2 papers from the same data. It was quite nice. And then we continued this, and we look how men age influence his preference for facial femininity, and we presented those pictures from different age group and around the world, and it was clear that it changed a lot with the age. So those men who were older, they had much weaker preference for femininity in men's face, and it was preference for femininity was highest when men were in 30s, and then it went down. It's known that men's testosterone start to reduce gradually after that, so maybe testosterone explains that, or maybe when men are old, then they are less choosy, so in general. So it's difficult to say why, but the pattern is quite clear. Of course, there is also one factor which influences on attractiveness that we didn't study in our study, because we tried to have as less variation in age as possible. And I think that none of you will be surprised to hear that age has strong effect on facial attractiveness. But because I'm an evolutionary biologist, I am working with other animals, it's not clear that animals, that males would prefer younger women as their mates, because in chimpanzees, males prefer older females as their mates. So it's composite opposite to humans, and that's because in chimpanzees, older females have higher fertility, and they are better to take care of their offsprings, so the survival of the offsprings is higher. So that's why female chimpanzees prefer older females. But in humans, we have one unique feature. Females, humans have menopause, and that menopause causes that those males who would prefer old females as their mate, they've got less offsprings because those old women are not able to reproduce. And in church record, they have shown that women reproductive value change a lot with age. So they have, this is from Australia more than 100 years ago, before birth control. They look what is the woman reproductive value in each age group. So it's mean the number of offspring what women can predict to produce during their lifetime. So the man, if man has been married with a woman who is in 40s, then he could have got maybe 1 or 2 children. But those men who did married women who were in 20s, they were able to get 10 or even more children. And that's why it's quite obvious that natural selection has preferred those men who prefer couples of young age as their mates. And if you wonder why the reproductive value is not highest here, is because during that time women did cause their first menstrual cycle in the age of 18, so they were not fertile during this time of year, and there was possible that they will die before they will burn, so that's why the reproductive value was lower before in the 80s or in the 20s. And so that's explain why men find the clues of young age as attractive in women. But luckily, men are very simple. So natural selection has only preferred those men who like to traits which are associated with young age. And so nowadays, women are able to retain those traits longer time, like smooth skin and things like that. So that's why women who are in 40s might still be attractive for men. And for example, here is a woman who is 50s, and he's still as attractive than any woman in 20s. And that's because men are not adapted to calculate the fitness benefits of mate choice. Instead, they are just react on those visual cues of young age. So that should be because usually women are worried about the age, so you don't need to be worried about your absolute age. You should be more worried about your general health, and because those play a stronger role. So, thank you for your attention. This was the first part of that lecture. Do you have any questions about evolutionary psychology of beauty? Yeah, there's a lot of studies that because close to menopause, women estrogen level drops, so it's influenced their quality of hair, it's influenced their body shape. They lose their hourglass body shape close to menopause, and of course it's quite a clear influence on attractiveness. Nowadays, there is hormone replacement therapy which many women use to prevent that. So, but it's interesting that if you look pictures taken 100 years ago, women looked much more older than nowadays. For example, I have seen pictures taken in the end of maybe 120 years ago, and those women who were 30s, it look like women who are in 60s nowadays. They look very old, and so the life was very harsh, and they had bad health and things like that. So that's why women should not be worried so much about the absolute age. It's only about how healthy you look like. And of course, you can reverse aging nowadays with many cosmetics things, and they look much younger. But it's interesting that the mate choice in humans is so different than in chimpanzees, because the chimpanzees do not have menopause, and that changes everything.
And so did the age of menopause also change during historical times? Is there any record about
I think that age of menopause hasn't changed much. It's age of the first menstrual cycle that has changed a lot, so that 100 years ago it was around 18 in Finland, but now it's like 12. So they start to reproduce more early because nutritional environment is better, and because women need to accumulate certain amount of fat tissue before the body starts to ovulate first time, because fat tissue produces estrogens. So it's aromatized testosterone to estrogen, and it's required to ovulate. So do you want to have a small break now, and we can continue with the next topic?
Okay, everybody, we will continue with another very interesting talk. Professor?
So I became interested about sexual orientation because it's not only interesting why there is homosexual, but how we developed heterosexual preference. What is the mechanism which make those who are heterosexual to prefer opposite sex, and what's the mechanism why some people prefer the same sex? So it's not only about that I would be interested about homosexual, I'm interested about the mechanism which make us to categorize sexual orientation, sexual attractiveness of other people. So why we usually are either heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual. What are the mechanisms behind that? And that homosexual behavior is evolutionary paradox. Usually natural selection prefer those individuals and genes which make individuals reproduce better. And of course homosexual behavior do not help to spread your genes, and that's why it's a paradox why natural selection hasn't not prevent people or animals to behave a homosexual way, because it doesn't have any fitness benefits. And interesting is that it's so widely spread behavior among animal kingdom. So far there is at least 1,500 animal species that have recorded to have homosexual behavior, and at least 500 of them has been studied in more details. And it's actually so that there is not a single species that reproduce sexually that has not recorded any homosexual behavior. So only species which reproduce parthogenetically, they don't have homosexual behavior. And it's actually quite surprising that the homosexual behavior might be very common in some species. For example, in giraffe, it has been recorded that 94% of all sexual activity is between males. And because it's so common, you need to have some kind of action. Why do males do that? Because, of course, it doesn't have direct benefits for males. And also, it's common among our close relatives. For example, in bonobos, 60% of all sexual activity is between females. And of course, sex between females doesn't make babies, so why they do it? It's actually quite interesting. So, in the light of those studies in other animals, that homosexuality is not so unnatural. Actually, it's quite natural thing. So actually, humans are only species which has homophobia. So yeah, homophobia is more unnatural. And if you are interested about homosexual behavior in animals, there is one good book published about that topic. But in this talk, I will focus more on studies in humans. And but if we want to understand human behavior, we of course need to understand about homosexual behavior in other animals too. And ethologists usually ignored evolutionary explanation for homosexual behavior because many of them just talk that homosexual behavior is just byproduct of high sexual drive of males. And that's explain why males sometimes even try to mate with other species. But that is poor explanation for many cases anyway, because there is studies to show that in many species there is males that have clear preference to mate with other males, even in the situation where males are able to choose between females and males. Some males still prefer to mate with other males. And for example, in rams, it has been shown that 8% of them are completely heterosexual. So in the situation where they are allowed to choose between females and males, they rather have sex with other males. And it's weird because you would expect that natural selection have eradicated those genes that make males homosexual. But because that behavior still exists, we need to have some kind of explanation for that. I'm pretty sure that they haven't, that is not cultural phenomenon. So there must be some kind of biological mechanism behind that. But it's important to remember that homosexual behavior is not same as homosexual orientation. And this is often a problem in the studies, they mix those concepts. For example, in jails, previously, at least when people were not able to meet their spouses and many heterosexual men start to have sex with other men, but when they get out from the jail, then they became heterosexual again. So there's a lot of studies, and also studies in rats has shown that if you put a lot of males to the same cage without any females, it won't take a long time before males start to have sex with each other. But as soon as they are allowed to mate with females, they rather mate with females than other males. So it's important to understand that behavior and orientation is not same. Orientation is more like whether you prefer one sex over another in the situation where you can freely choose which one you want. And there is individuals who have homosexual orientation, but they never behave in a homosexual way because of religion or other things. And that's why if you want to understand homosexual orientation, you should keep in mind that just measuring behavior is, in case of women, might not be enough. So it seems that homosexual behavior is very old in human species, and of course, because it's common among animal kingdom, people should not be surprised that it's also common in humans, and there is a lot of evidence through the history that it's existed already 5,000 years ago, and around the world there is a lot of very old evidence that it exists. So, and there is not a single culture in humans where homosexual orientation wouldn't exist, or homosexual behavior. It's interesting that there is a cultural variation in the way how homosexual behavior has been done and how the orientation is expressed. It's usually divided into 3 different groups. One is gender stratified system, and second is age stratified system, and third is egalitarian system. And if you want to understand evolutionary psychology behind this homosexual behavior, you should keep in mind that these systems are quite different, and it seems that the gender stratified system was the one which we had during the thousands of millions years, and this egalitarian system, which I will present, is a novel phenomenon. For example, in those tribes which live hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and many traditional cultures nowadays still have that gender stratified system where homosexual men adopt the role of third sex. And it's very interesting that in those cultures, those homosexual men do not practice sex with other homosexual men. It sounds weird, but yeah, that's the case. So they behave like women and they dress like women and they practice sex with heterosexual men. So the heterosexual men in those cultures who practice sex with these third sex people, they don't consider themselves as homosexual. And this was the prevailing homosexual system in our evolutionary history. There is also other systems like this age-stratified system. This is common nowadays still in, for example, Afghanistan, where they practice bacha, which is called as a boy play, where young men dress up like a woman and men just practice sex with them. And in many cases, those men are not homosexuals. They are just forced to dress up like women and have sex with men. And there was a study made before the war in Afghanistan that about half of men in Kandahar had sex with these boys. And this is practice is common there because Islam prevents extramarital sex with women. So if men want to have sex with other than their wives, only option is to practice sex with young boys. And of course this is a big problem, and during the war many Americans saw that practice and they complained, but US authorities say that they should ignore those and respect their culture there. And so it was in news, but people just forget the whole thing. But it's still a common practice in Afghanistan. And there is this third culture is this egalitarian homosexual system, which is originally from Scandinavia. So during the Viking time, people, those homosexual adopted the role of third gender, but when the Christianity came, Christianity says that it's not okay to have homosexual sex, so or to adopt the third gender. So the homosexual men start to dress up like heterosexual men and have sex with other homosexual, and that's why they start to behave more masculine way, because homosexual men find masculinity as attractive in men. So it changed their culture completely. And if we want to understand evolutionary psychology of homosexual behavior, if we just look this system, we don't see the big picture, because they behave a completely different way than it was originally. Homosexual behavior and homosexual orientation seems to be quite common in humans. First study about this topic was made by Kinsey, where he interviewed almost 3,000 Americans, and they found that 37% had homosexual sex and 10% were primarily homosexual. This is quite large numbers, because during that time it was illegal to be homosexual, and then they did admit that in their test. Later, study found that 22% of Americans men had homosexual sex, and 9% of were homosexual. And there is studies which are quite good quality done in Finland, where they have collected quite representative sample. And in Finland, they found that 8% of men reported they had sex with other men, and only 0.9 to 1.3 men had complete homosexual. So it seems that there is also variation between different countries. And but it is important to remember that those self-reported studies probably underestimate the frequency of homosexual men, because many men who are homosexual, they probably don't answer honestly, especially those who are religious background. And nowadays also many homosexual men have children, because they want to have children, and the only way is to go married with women, but they still have homosexual preference. That's very different from those cultures which have third gender, because, for example, in Samoa, where they have studied this, not a single homosexual man had children because they were not interested. Instead, they did help their sister and brothers to take care of their children and so on. And nowadays there is a lot of studies about heredity of homosexual origins, and it's very interesting whether there is genes that make person homosexual. And first studies about this topic were twin studies, where they found that 52% of the monozygotic co-twins of males homosexual were also homosexuals, and 22% of zygotic co-twins were also homosexual. And in adopted brothers, 11% were also homosexuals. So it shows that genes play a role in homosexual orientation, and that is paradox, because why natural selection has not eradicated those genes that make person vulnerable for homosexual behavior. In Finland, they did large twin studies 12 years ago, where they found that heritability of sexual orientation was 50%. And later, there has been studies where they have tried to find single genes which are causing that. And the best study so far was genome-wide association study with almost 500,000 participants. And they found that there was a single nuclear polymorphism on 5 chromosomes, 4, 7, 11, 12, and 15. So it's very interesting why those genes exist. So what we know about homosexuality is that you can see some hints about possible sexual orientation already in the early childhood, so that those who are homosexual, they have higher odds that they have sex atypical behavior during the childhood. They prefer a little bit different kind of hobbies than heterosexual men, and also they prefer to cross-dress much more frequently than heterosexual men. And especially in Brazil, it has been shown that homosexuals were more likely avoid playing soccer as children than heterosexuals, and also homosexual men are less interested about outdoors and contact sports. And it's quite. I work as a taekwondo coach, and during the 15 years I have seen only one man practicing taekwondo who were clearly homosexual. So it's pretty rare among homosexual. And because it was previously think that problem is with homosexuals that they would behave more feminine ways, and because it was the law prevent it was illegal to be homosexual, they tried to cure them and they gave testosterone them. But it was surprising that when they gave testosterone, they didn't change their behavior. Instead, they become more interested about homosexual sex, because that testosterone just increased their sex drive. So it seems that the reason why homosexual men are homosexual is not because they won't have enough testosterone. Instead, there seems to be a difference in brain morphology between homosexual and heterosexual males. But so far, we are not sure whether it's those differences are cause or consequences of homosexual behavior, because it's possible that behavior also changes the brain structure. But there is some evidence that, for example, homosexual men have larger suprachiasmatic nuclei of the hypothalamus. This is interesting because this is the part of the brain which influences on your circadian rhythm. So why homosexual men would have a different this part of brain? They have also smaller intestinal nuclei of the anterior hypothalamus I will show it later, and they have larger anterior commissure and thicker isthmus of the corpus callosum. So there are those parts which connect different hemispheres. And the most interesting part is this intestinal nuclei of the anterior compound, because in other animals they have shown that if you damage this part of the brain, males become homosexual. And they have shown in humans that in females it's different than in males, and in homosexual males it's more similar to females than heterosexual males. And the biggest difference is amount of cells in that area. The homosexual men has less cells in that area. And it's interesting that they have even shown that when a person has got tumor in this area, the tumor has changed person's sexual orientation. And also the difference, this corpus callosum and this which connect different parts of brain, and there is also sex differences in that. So the females usually have larger corpus callosum and anterior commissure than males. So females have better connection between different hemispheres, and so it seems that strange structure in somehow are more similar to females in homosexual men than to heterosexual men. And there are also studies to show that their brain function a little bit different way. In this study, it was published in PNAS, they exposed men to pheromones, and they were able to show that homosexual men did response on pheromones from the males, but heterosexual men didn't response on that. Instead, heterosexual women responded quite similar way than homosexual men. And when they were exposed to pheromones from women, homosexual men didn't respond the similar way than heterosexual men. So it seems that their response to pheromones of opposite sex is different. And it's interesting that there is also large sex differences in visual spatial ability between homosexual and heterosexual. And if we compare brain function difference between men and women, this is the largest difference. So women are less good in visual spatial ability than men. And for example, they test like this, so that person should choose which one of these are similar to these. And in this kind of test, men do much better than women, and those homosexual men are more similar to straight females than straight men, and lesbians are more similar to men than heterosexual women. So what we could say is that in nutshell, that homosexual men have on average more feminine brain morphology than in heterosexual. And what is interesting, it's why they have, and what is the mechanism. And there are studies to show that there are no apparent difference in the androgen receptors of the homosexual and heterosexual men. So it's not about that, and we know that it's not about the testosterone levels during the adulthood. So it's interesting, what is the mechanism behind that? And we know that during the development in the womb, sex hormone influence whether the brains develop as male brains or female brains. And it's shown that it takes place during the second trimester of the gestation. And it seems that if that during the 12 to 18 weeks of the pregnancy, and the testosterone level peaks, and during the end of pregnancy, the testosterone level may be 10 times higher in male babies than in female. And another peak will appear just after the birth during the 3 months when the testosterone level of the babies are similar to adult men, and then it goes down until it starts again during the puberty. And it seems that during this time those hormones influence how masculine or feminine your brains will be during the adulthood. And it's interesting that testosterone is not the hormone which makes brain masculine. Instead, it's estrogen. So that during the development, testosterone aromatized in the brains to estrogen, and estrogen is the hormone which makes brain more masculine. And body is masculinized when testosterone is converted to dihydrotestosterone by the 5-alpha reductase. And that's the problem, because the different hormone cause masculinization of the body and masculinization of the brain. So it's possible that person feels that the body doesn't match with the brain, so that people might think that he has born to the wrong body of the wrong sex. And what is important to know that during the development in the womb, female features do not produce any sex hormones. And that's why their brains are not masculinized because of estrogen. And only testes produce testosterone, which is able to aromatize and masculinize the brains. And there is beautiful studies in other animals where they have exposed pregnant females to large amount of estrogens, and they have shown that after that female offspring become homosexual. So it has been shown that it's masculinized the brain. And it's interesting that in rats they have shown that if rat females experience stress during the critical period of the pregnancy, the testosterone release can come too early before the aromatase enzymes are ready to convert to estrogen, and as a result, the male lust circuit in the brain does not develop normally, and that male behave homosexual way. But their body still remains masculine because testosterone is still able to convert to dihydrotestosterone, which builds the male typical body. And there is some studies in humans which suggest that if mother experiences stress during the pregnancy, during the critical time of the pregnancy, they have higher odds to have homosexual sons. And for example, there was a study in Germany where they collected data from those mothers who were pregnant during the hardest years during the Second World War, and they found that those boys born during that time, they had higher odds to be homosexual than those born before or after war. And if you are interested about this physiological mechanism, I recommend you to read this book by Levy, Gay, Straight, and the Reason Why. So one thing which I became interested was rigid ratio, because it has been shown that females and male hands differ from each other, so that in women their second digit is usually longer, or at least as long as the fourth digit, and in men that second digit is usually shorter. And there is studies to show that they are associated with many traits. Of course, there is variation that there is men who have long second finger, and females who have very short. And but the sex difference is clear. And it was published in year 2000 in Nature, a study where they saw that those men who had a more feminine digit ratio, they have higher odds to be homosexual, and those women who have more masculine digit ratio, they have higher odds to be homosexual. And to me, this was hard to believe. So my student once asked what kind of study they could carry out, and I said that okay, you could replicate this study, and I sent them to collect data, and after we had collected data from 100 individuals, I just looked at the data, and I was surprised because there was very strong effect that those men who were homosexual, they had much more feminine digit ratio, and I asked them to continue collecting data, and they collected more than 800 hands from men, and this was the result. So there was very strong effect that those men who had feminine digit ratio, they were homosexual. But interestingly, in Finland, it was opposite, so that those women who have more feminine digit ratio, they were more likely to be homosexual. So that was totally opposite than in nature paper. Later, I did understand the mechanism behind that, but I will explain it later. So, what do you think? Is possible to see sexual orientation from the face? Because if we know that sex hormones during the development influence on your sexual orientation, we could also expect that all other traits which are associated with sex hormones might be correlated with sexual orientation. And there is these studies done in cases which shows that homosexual men have a little bit different facial structure than heterosexual men. But what is interesting is that actually this jaw is a little bit different, and also this area is more feminine, so it's like a mosaicism. And recently they published a study where they teach artificial intelligence to identify sexual orientation. So they did show them thousands of faces from heterosexual, homosexual males. They collected from the online dating sites of homosexual men and online dating sites of heterosexual men. And that artificial intelligence learned to identify sexual orientation, and they found that computer algorithm could correctly distinguish between gay and straight men in 80% of the time, and 74% in women. So it's just based in one single picture. So that means that there is already programs which can use surveillance cameras or security cameras. They can identify not only the sex of the person, but the sexual orientation of the person. It's quite scary, actually. You can, and that the present will become even stronger if you present more pictures from the same faces. So it come close to 90%. And now studies also suggest that there might be different subgroups of homosexual men because they have a little bit different biomarkers, and that may explain why those evolutionary psychological theories has been so difficult to apply, because not all homosexual men are similar. So they have shown that in some males, homosexuality is associated with the handedness, so that homosexual men have more often left-handed, and fraternal birth order influence, and also the number of relatives with homosexual tendencies or orientation. And so there is a lot of studies to show that there is anatomical difference. For example, it's interesting that homosexual men have larger penis than heterosexual men, and it seems that those hormonal environment during the womb actually influence on those. Maybe it's influence on receptor of testosterone, and there's brain anatomy differences. And it's in what we found also in our data, and research around the world has found the same, is that sexual orientation correlates quite strongly with birth order. So those who are homosexual, on average, they have many more older brothers than those who are heterosexuals. And it has been shown that each additional older brother increased the odds of homosexuality in the next male born by about 33%. So it's actually quite strong effect. So if you have 7 older brothers, then the odds that you are homosexual is much higher. And it has been suggested that maybe the mechanism behind this effect of birth order is immune response against proteins that is coded by chromosome Y. Because women do not carry that, then that protein doesn't exist in women. And it has been suggested that late birth order and sex ratio reflect progressive immunization in some mothers to this antigen presented in male fetus, and the number of pregnancy with male fetus increased the effect of this maternal immune reaction, and it should reduce sexual difference of brain in the male fetus. And they have published studies where they have collected blood from the mothers and look how much they produce this antigen, and they found that those women who had homosexual offerings, they have higher amount of this antigen in their blood. So it's possible that this is mechanism behind that fraternal birth order on sexual orientation. And of course, psychologists often explain that homosexual behavior is caused by childhood experiences and that, but there is no evidence for that. There is actually a lot of counter evidence for that, because there is cases where men have lost their penis and they have tried to make him a woman, they have raised her as a female offsprings and hope that she would adopt female personality and behavior, but it seems that it doesn't help. So they have not been able to change sexual identification or sexual orientation just by raising them in different sex roles. And in psychoanalysis theories, they suggest that that homosexual behavior be result for example, close binding between mothers, or absent or distant father, or unconscious hatred of their mothers, or envy of brother's penis, but there is no evidence to support for any of these hypotheses. And actually there is no support for any kind of audible period during the childhood. This is very clear. And so what are those environmental factors that cause sexual orientation after the birth? And there is evidence that homosexuality is not linked with problems in child relationship with their parents, and homosexuality does not involve fear of hatred of people of the other gender. Sexual orientation is not linked with current levels of sex hormones in the blood. As such, most homosexuals were not molested or otherwise sexually victimized by adult homosexuals. So if there are environmental factors after birth that influence on sexual orientation, we do not yet know what are these. So it seems that we have evidence only that environment during the womb influence on sexual orientation, but no evidence that anything after that influences sexual orientation. Of course, environment influence on sexual behavior. It's possible that the heterosexual men behave homosexual way and vice versa, but it seems that sexual orientation doesn't change after birth. So what are those evolutionary hypotheses for this homosexual behavior or orientation? There is many of those. Common hypothesis is this alliance formation hypothesis. It's especially popular among those who studied primates. They suggest that homosexual behavior would be some kind of adaptation for making better same-sex alliances, but there is no evidence for that in humans. It may explain homosexual behavior in bonobos, but it doesn't, bonobo females, but it doesn't explain homosexual behavior in human males. Most interesting hypothesis was presented by Edward O. Wilson, 1975, who suggested that maybe homosexuals in non-technological societies function as helpers. He suggested maybe they were similar to ants workers or bee workers who give up their own reproduction in order to help their mother to raise offsprings. And so if a homosexual sufficiently increases the reproductive success of the kin, then genetic material transmitted to the next generation via kin and held in common with the homosexual by virtue of relatedness may offset the homosexual's lack of offspring. But recent empirical studies in Western world have found that homosexuals do not act as helpers or do not give more financial or emotional resources to siblings than do heterosexual men. But problem is that maybe cultural things has changed so much that we are not able to understand evolutionary psychological things behind this sexual orientation if we look people who have adopted the modern Western lifestyle. So was this case in our evolutionary environment? And for example, it's known that in evolutionary history, homosexual Native Americans were often visionaries, the healers and medical people and the nannies of orphans and the caregivers, and they were actually respected and fundamental components of the culture and societies. And when people have studied some people who still have third gender, there is evidence that actually it's possible that their role is like a helpers for them. For example, they expect significantly higher altruistic tendencies toward nieces and nephews than do someone, women and heterosexual men, and they had also significantly higher altruistic tendencies even compared to with childless heterosexual men and women who like these papapians, which are the third genders, and then they have no direct childcare responsibilities. So studies suggest that maybe they actually might work as helpers, and so they may increase their spread of their genes to next generation by helping their sisters and brothers to take care of their children. And there is also another mechanism which might explain homosexual behavior. It seems that it might be possibly maintained by sexually antagonistic effect or pleiotrophy. For example, in a study made on families with homosexual men in Italy, it was found that their mothers and sisters had more offspring than heterosexual. And after that, that's been replicated in other studies. So it seems that those genes that make men homosexual, they could give higher reproductive advantage to women who carry the same genes. And recently it was published a very interesting study using results from genome-wide association study on number of opposite-sex sexual partners with 348,000 individuals that among heterosexuals, genetic effects associated with homosexual behavior are associated with having more opposite sexual partners. So it's possible that those genes indeed that make men more likely to be homosexual, they might increase fitness of women. And they were able to do computer simulation that suggested that mating advantage for the alleles associated with homosexual behavior could actually help explain how it has been evolutionary minded, so that so it seems to be theoretically possible that the reason why still have homosexual behavior, even if you could expect natural selection would have eradicated, is because the same genes give advantage for the women who carry that, and maybe also advantage for those men who have the genes but they don't have homosexual orientation, because for example, if they are the first sons in the family, then they have much higher odds that they will be heterosexual than homosexual. So, of course, it's important to remember that men are not only homosexual or heterosexual. Instead, there is variation between the degree of homosexual. But most of men are, anyway, they are heterosexual, and so the distribution of age is not that there is everything between that, but of course there's individuals who fall in each categories, and this is Kinsey scale, which say that 6 was completely homosexual and 0 was completely heterosexual, and there was variation between that. But some males prefer both bisexual and prefer both sex. And Lippa did studies 15 years ago where he was able to show that those men who say that they are bisexual, well, they actually were homosexual men who just have so high sex drive that they accepted both sex as their sexual partners. So it seems that there is still some individuals who prefer both sex, but most of them are just homosexual men who have just high sex drive. So I will tell you a story about homosexual behavior in females. Do you want to have a break in this case, or do I continue?
There is a question here.
Yeah.
There is a question from the internet and YouTube's asking about if there is any study on sex differences, no, on brain difference between bisexual and homosexual or heterosexual individuals.
To my knowledge, there is no studies in bisexual, because the number of bisexuals in men is so rare that they usually have just studied heterosexual compare heterosexual to homosexuals. But to my knowledge, there's some in women, but because sexual orientation in women is more fluid, or there's more variation, and so it's much easier to collect data from bisexual women than from bisexual men. But the reason why I became interested about homosexual behavior was not about homosexual behavior in men, but I was interested about homosexual behavior in women. And we published a couple of years ago a review article about homosexual behavior in women. So if you are interested about this.
Before you start, may I have a question?
Yeah.
Actually, before we run away from the male
Yeah.
sexual behavior, could you go back to the? I would like to see again the picture with the figure of birth order, that study by Bogart 2018, the new one, because I'm not really sure that it actually, yes, it's this one, because the hypothesis is that actually the immunological reaction should get stronger with each male fetus, right? So actually there should be a difference between mothers who have gay sons and mothers who have straight sons, right? But actually, no, yeah, and then there is this, yes, And so that's the first difference, right? That's this one. It's actually quite weak, but anyway. But the problematic is that actually there is no difference between mothers of sons who have no older brothers and those who have older brothers, which is these two groups. And I thought that actually for testing directly this hypothesis, there should be actually a difference between these two groups, right? Because mothers of gay sons who have older brothers should actually have different reaction than mothers of gay sons with no older brothers.
But they are both exposed to the antigen. So, but both of these are exposed to that Y antigen, so you don't expect this difference being so large as if you compare these ones. And of course, this is the most important, that those who have only female offspring, that they don't have those antibodies so many. But problem is that you might be exposed on those if you have miscarriages. So it's possible that some of the, so that's also a problem, but that may explain why they still have those antibodies. Yeah, but of course, the sample size should have been larger. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it was a good point. Yeah. So if you are interested about this topic, this is quite long review about topic. I'm not able to cover all aspects in this talk, but I will give at least some taste. And so that homosexual behavior is not similar paradox in females than in males. That's because in many cases homosexual women do reproduce and have offsprings. And in some cases it might be even adaptive. For especially in Lasian albatrosses, it has been shown that if females are not able to find the males, because males mortality is higher in the, among these, then two females may form a pair and have sex with males, because it's easy to get sex with males who are in a pair bond. They are able to reproduce. Of course, their reproductive success is not as good as those who are paired with males, but it's better than not reproducing at all. And also in humans, they have shown that many women who classify them as homosexuals, they still have children. And actually that sexual orientation differs a lot between sexes. So homosexual men are more bipolar. They are either gay or straight. There is less men who are bisexuals. But in women, that orientation is more continuum. There's much more women who are bisexuals. And actually, also those women who are completely homosexuals, they are very rare. And for example, in a study where they looked those in Australia, found that only 7% of those women who classify themselves as lesbian have never had sexual intercourse with men. And this is a quite important factor, because it means that in evolutionary environment, if you have been homosexual and you have practiced sex with men, you probably end up having babies. Nowadays there is contraception and you can have sex without men, but never becoming pregnant. But if I would be a zoologist studying other animals, I wouldn't classify women who classify them as lesbians. I wouldn't classify them as homosexual. I would classify them as bisexual. But it's also interesting that their behavior is something that usually we don't think, because we think that homosexual women are not interested about men, but when the researchers did a study, they found that that women who classify themselves as lesbian, they have had on average 2 times more male sex partners than women who classify themselves as heterosexual. So that's not what happens in men. Homosexual men do not have more heterosexual sex partners than heterosexual. So this is completely opposite. And from the evolutionary psychology point of view, this difference is very important if you want to understand evolutionary mechanism behind these preferences. And what is also interesting is that homosexual women start their sexual life a couple of years earlier than heterosexual women, and they usually start their life with heterosexual sex with men, and gradually they turn more lesbian with time. And of course, in the evolutionary environment, this means that those would end up having children in younger age than those who were heterosexual. And in UK, they did a study in more than 30,000 women, and they found that bisexual women had higher fecundity at an early age, but when they became older, there was no difference between sexes anymore. So this shows that homosexual behavior is not paradox in evolution sense, because they have, in some situations, it might be even a benefit if natural selection prefer reproduction in young age. In that age case, it might prefer bisexual females. So there is a lot of studies about prevalence of homosexual behavior in women. The first one was made by Kinsey, where they interviewed almost 6,000 women, and they found that 13% of them had organs from sex with other women, and 2% of them were homosexual, or at least they labeled themselves as homosexual. Of course, this was time when sex between women was not as common accepted in cultural level as nowadays. And later, the prevalence has become more common. In 1993, it was found that 17% had homosexual sex, and 5% of American women classified themselves as gay or bisexual. But only 1 to 2% of women can say that they were exclusive homosexual. So it seems that exclusive homosexuality is very rare. Actually, this is, sorry, I didn't change that in English, but it's Finnish data where they have collected prevalences of homosexual orientation in women, and it's interesting that the latest one, 40% of Finnish women say that they are not completely heterosexual, and so you can see that the older women are, the less odd that they were homosexual. There's huge change in sexual orientation during the last 40, 50 years. So we don't know the reason for that. Is that environmental factors, hormonal factors, or is that society that has changed a lot? But we don't know that, but it's very surprising. Okay, that was actually the same picture 2 times, yeah. And there is actually a lot of studies to show that the most women who classify themselves as heterosexual, they still respond the way that could be interpreted that they are not completely heterosexual. For example, when they present films or photos from women, they have shown with this equipment that which they put inside women, that they feel sexual arousal when they see naked women or sex between women, and also majority of self-identified heterosexual women experience pupil dilation when viewing erotic photos of same-sex sex. So this is quite surprising because we don't have same kind of phenomenon in men. So it seems that most women are not completely heterosexual. There was a study published 15 years ago in Finland where they had more than 6,000 Finns, and they found that 64.5% of them admitted that they have potential to have sex with other women. They don't find it aversive. So this is quite surprising because that was not what I expected when I started to study this topic. And also, it seems that there is two different kind of homosexual women. This is not invented by evolutionary psychology. This categorizing homosexual to two groups was developed by sociologists more than 50 years ago. They noticed that there is two different types of homosexual women. One is a very male type, very masculine behavior, which are called as puts, and another one is femme, and it's interesting that they often are attracted to each other, so that those puts females prefer feminine women and femme females prefer masculine women. And studies have shown that most of homosexual women are able to classify themselves to be either puts or femme. And those femme behave very feminine. They could even say to be super feminine in their behavior. And puts behave very male typical time, and their sexual behavior is more male type. And so we probably need different evolutionary explanation to explain both types. So that femme lesbians might be easier to explain. And for example, maybe it's related to women's greater malleability in the determinants of sexual orientation. For example, it may be that women's ability to change their preference might be adaptive in situations where previously where women are not have been able to secure a man who would be high enough in quality to long-term relationships. So in some cases it might be better to choose a woman who is masculine and is able to take care of children. So also it's possible that in situations where there's shortage of men, it might be better to women to have a long-term relationship with masculine behaving women who are being able to maybe hunt or protect the family. Also, it's possible that this is just alternative reproductive strategy, like fast life history strategy, but there is not so much evidence that. But there is evidence in pigeons where they have shown that in situations where females are not able to get mates, they rather pair with other females than stay alone. But that explanation of puts lesbian is more difficult. So it seems that it might be associated with higher prenatal androgen hormone exposure. That's why their body is also more masculine than in case of female lesbians. And we don't know the ultimate mechanism behind that. There is not good studies about that, but it's possible that there's similar kind of antagonistic pleiotrophy than in case of homosexuality in men. Maybe the genes which make females as a butch lesbians, they might make males more masculine and increase their reproduce success. We don't know that, but it's good hypothesis to test. And we know the proximative mechanism. We know that what happens in the womb influence on your sexual orientation. And we published this year a model which probably explain the origin of sexual orientation. So, because we know that the masculinization of the brain is caused by aromatized estrogen. We know that androgens, testosterone and dihydrotestosterone, they masculinize the body. So that may explain why we have those different times, so that heterosexual women have low amount of aromatized estradiol and testosterone. But those who are lesbians, they have a lot of estradiol, so some part of their brain are masculinized, but their body is actually super feminized. So, and the interesting thing is why? Because women are not able to produce estrogen when they are in the womb, so that estrogen must come from the mother. And it's possible that placenta in those cases produce estrogen and they make them more feminine. And it's interesting why. It's possible that in certain situations it might be adaptive for mother to manipulate sexual orientation of the offspring. And if you are exposed both to high estrogen level and testosterone, then you get butch lesbian. And if you are exposed to very high testosterone level, then you probably become cunephilic transsexuals. And if you have exposed to very low amount of estradiol but high number of testosterone, you become first tomboys, and if the exposure is very low, then you become androphilic transsexuals. So this is good hypothesis. I hope that this matches very well with empirical evidence. So let's hope that this is the correct one. And there is actually evidence to support that for that hypothesis, that maybe the reason why there is homosexual is that they have a different mechanism. And in the 1930s to 1960s, they gave a lot of I don't know how to pronounce the estropestrol drug, which was given to pregnant women in order to prevent miscarriage. But problem was that this was estrogen mimicking drug, and it came out that it didn't prevent miscarriage, but it increased the probability that female side became bisexual or homosexual, which support our hypothesis that amount of estrogen increased those that you will be femme-lesbian. And there is also studies to show that smoking increase testosterone level in women, and if a woman smoke when she is pregnant, it's increased that the child will be homosexual, and they have higher odds to be butch lesbians. And interesting, in birth, they have shown that if they provide estrogen, it increased the odds that female will become a homosexual or make pair bonds in adult with other females. But it's interesting, it was found that only happens if you prevent them from socialization with males when they are juveniles. So this suggests that in contrast to males, it's possible that in females, the social environment influence on sexual orientation after the sexual. So in men, it's clear that environment after the birth doesn't have an influence on sexual orientation, but that's not seems to be the case in women. And that's my explain why there has been so huge change in prevalence of homosexual behavior in women during the last decades. It's possible that some environmental factors has changed. We just don't know what, but if the same phenomenon happens in humans than in birth, then it's possible. And also there is interesting drug called lithocycline, which was also given to pregnant women, and it's progesterone, and progesterone also influence on testosterone and estrogen levels, and it has been shown that it increases the prevalence of homosexual. Its effect is actually quite strong. So this also supports the hypothesis that the hormonal environment in the womb influence sexual orientation. And there is also this disorders with or syndromes which support the hypothesis that the sex hormones during the development influence sexual orientation. One is this completely androgen insensitivity syndrome. In this syndrome, there have a mutation that cause that testosterone receptor do not work as they should. And those individuals who are genetically male with this syndrome, they develop so that when they become teenagers, they look like typical female. They have female body, and their external genitals are like women's genitals. But they are usually recognized during the teenage years when they go to meet medical doctors because they lack a menstrual cycle, and then they with ultrasound they found usually that they have testes inside their body instead of ovaries. And what is interesting is that their gender identity is typically female, but they are homosexual. So in that case, that they prefer females as their mates, and that's because even they don't have testosterone receptors, that testosterone aromatizes to estrogen and masculinize their brains, so they sexual orientation is changed because of that, even they don't have testosterone. That's proof that it's the estrogen that masculinized brains, not the testosterone. And there is also another disorder called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and those women who have this, they have higher levels of androgen during the uterus, and that's why they have masculinized behavior and personality, and they have 6 times higher likelihood to be non-heterosexual compared to the unaffected women. And like I told you, in homosexual men also, it seems to be that the brains of those women who are completely homosexuals, or classify them as completely homosexual, they differ from heterosexual women. When they were exposed to male pheromones, lesbians do not react on that. Instead, heterosexual women react on that, and heterosexual men do not react that. But when lesbians are exposed to pheromones of women, their brains are activated, but when heterosexual women are exposed, then that hypothalamus is not activated. Also, males do a response on that. So it seems that there is a difference in brains. And it's also interesting that the facial morphology of homosexual women differ, so that it's possible to identify from facial picture what is the sexual orientation. And And there is also sexual dimorphism during the development, and it seems that those who are butch lesbians, they have more masculinized body shape, so they have the arm to stature ratio is more close to the men than heterosexual women. And it seems that interesting that also those butch-type lesbians exist in other animals. For example, in lions, there is female lions who look like males, and they behave like males. And it would be interesting to know whether they have similar kind of mechanisms behind that. So it seems that those adaptionistic explanations do not fully explain sexual behavior in humans, because social and historical factors also play strong. However, those adaptionist explain properly the origin of sexual orientation. So it's important to remember that how people behave, it's not always the same thing, what is their preferences. Of course, there is also a problem when you are speaking about human sexuality or gender, because people have different opinions. But of course, I'm naturalist and I rely on science. And for example, we know that in biology, sex is defined according to the size of gonads or sex cells. So, for example, males produce small cells called sperm, and females produce cells that are big ones. And if a person doesn't produce any of sex cells, then it does not have sex. We don't have third sex, and sex is not continuum. Biological sex is just you are either male or female, or you don't have that. So it's quite clear. But what is important to remember, the gender identity, the psychological sense of self, it's continuum, and also gender expression, how you dress up and behave, it's continuum, and sexual orientation is continuum. Of course, there is a group called asexual who don't have any preference, but so that's make it difficult to communicate with those people studying gender studies, or because they don't see biological sex as a similar way. But this type of classification has used hundreds of years, so there is no sense to change it because somebody does not like the idea that there is biological sexes. And interesting thing is that not only sexual orientation may vary, but also gender identity might not match with biological sex. And the interesting question is why. So there is people who are transgendered, so they feel that their gender identity does not match with biological sex. And it's important to remember that we are living a very different lifestyle, and so that, for example, previously it was not possible to do surgical operation and change sex. So if you wanted to be another sex, you were able to adopt third gender and look like, but nowadays you can modify your body to look like females, and it's quite interesting why there's so many people who want to make surgical operation to change their sex. Are those people who in the evolutionary environment they would have just adopted third gender, or are they different? It's very interesting questions, but we know that previously they just adopted that third gender and they tried to look like opposite sex in order to attract heterosexual men to have sex with them. And when people have done studies on those transgender people, they have noticed that they have difference in sex, which is not same than difference in sexual orientation. And they found that those men who did feel that, those biological men who didn't feel that they were men, instead they felt that they were women. They had differences in the stria terminalis. So the cisgender men, those men who feel that they are men, they have much more cells in that area than women, and those transgender women, they have more similar this area. And what is interesting here is that they have looked, it's associated with homosexuality, that this area in homosexual men is almost larger in those homosexual men who are happy about their sexual their sex, so that they are happy to be man in the man and in man body. But those men who are transsexuals who want to turn to female, they have even more feminine part of stria terminalis than in females. So they are feeling more feminine than average women. So this difference is actually quite interesting. So not all homosexual men want to be women, and there is brain difference which explain that. And so there is some of those dissections. You can see that this is a heterosexual man, this heterosexual woman. You can see a clear difference, and this is a homosexual men, and this is those male to females transgender. So why evolutionary origin of sexual orientation is important to understand? That's because, for example, studies in USA show that many people still think that sexual orientation is something which people just choose, but that not seems to be the case. Or even sometimes people think that those people who are transgender, they have some kind of mental disorder, but it's not mental disorder. Their brains are just different. And for example, nowadays around the world, there is still countries where being homosexuals is illegal, and you will get strong punishments of being homosexual. They may even kill you. And that's sad, because it seems that sexual orientation is like, at least in men, it's like eye color, so you're just born with it and you are not able to change it. And for example, last Pope said that saving humanity from homosexual behavior is more important than saving rainforest from the destructions. So I think that they should probably understand the evolutionary cycle behind that better. And because around 4 people still doesn't, they are still homophobic. Being homosexual cause problems, and for example, 71.4% of gay and lesbians have major depressive disorder, and many of them have anxiety disorder, and if you want to alleviate their health, it's good to educate people that sexual orientation is not something that people just can choose, and teaching evolutionary psychology probably would help their position. So thank you for your attention, and do you have any questions about this topic?
About your periodic table, about lesbians in different hormones levels that you actually reviewed in the paper with Savary. As far as I remember now, I'm not imagining the table, but actually the first line was high in cortisol and high in testosterone, so that these women actually would be butches, and
It was not
Oh, so, yes, it was, yeah, that's true. And so actually these, and the two extremes points, they would actually lead to transsexuals, right, or transgenders. But actually on the lower part, that would also lead to transgender people, but probably a different kind of transgenders, right? Because one of them probably would be oriented, or one of them would prefer males as sexual partners, and the other one would prefer females as sexual partners, right? Yes, exactly. Yes. Yes. Yes, exactly. So this is actually interesting because this matches the autogenephilia theory, right? Showing actually that there are really at least two like very different types of female to male transsexuals. And yeah, I don't even know actually if the authors of autogenephilia are talking about these differences in androgens and yeah, aromatized estradiol. But actually this is, I think, crucial for the theory of autogenephilia. What do you think about it?
Let's hope that this is the correct model, because this would be, like in chemistry, you have a periodic table. If it would be periodic table for sexual orientation, it would be quite cool. And of course, this would explain very elegantly why there is sometimes those transsexuals who have sexual orientation which doesn't match those prevailing hypotheses. But it's so that aromatized estradiol plays a different role than testosterone, then it would explain it quite elegantly. Yeah. So, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the attention, and I think we will continue tomorrow in the afternoon with the topics of evolutionary psychopathology, right? So thank you again very much.